"I didn't betray the Empire," Ethan Cole said quietly as the verdict echoed across the chamber. "I protected something it couldn't understand." The Hall of Judgment stretched wider than a football field, its polished obsidian floor reflecting rows of silent observers who never blinked, never shifted, never questioned the outcome already decided long before Ethan was brought in. Chains of light that hummed faintly against his wrists, his boots leaving soft, measured steps that echoed too loudly in the vacuum-still air, as if the room itself wanted him to feel every second of what was coming. Above him the vaulted ceiling shimmered with slow-moving constellations projected in perfect precision, a reminder that this empire spanned more stars than any human could count, and yet in this moment, it all felt smaller than the man standing alone at its center. Ethan didn't look up at them, didn't glance at the council seated high above like carved statues of authority. His gaze stayed forward, calm, steady, as though he were already somewhere else, somewhere quieter, where judgment didn't come wrapped in ceremony and silence. The charge had been read, repeated, and recorded: treason, a word that carried weight across species and systems, a word that demanded consequence, and yet Ethan had offered no defense, not a single objection, not even a hesitation, which unsettled more than it satisfied, because humans were known for their defiance, their unpredictability, their refusal to accept fate without a fight. But Ethan Cole stood there like a man who had already made peace with the outcome, like someone who had chosen this path long before stepping into the light. High above, partially obscured by the shifting glow of starlight projections, Empress Lyra Vera sat unmoving on her elevated throne, her presence defined not by motion but by gravity itself, the kind that pulled every gaze upward without effort. Her skin held a soft blue luminescence under the chamber's artificial constellations, her eyes unreadable, fixed on Ethan with a focus that betrayed nothing and yet concealed everything. No one noticed the slight tightening of her fingers against the armrest, no one heard the near-silent change in her breathing, but something in the stillness around her had shifted, subtle, dangerous, like the moment before a storm decides to exist. The council's final decree cut through the chamber with precise authority. "Ethan Cole, you are hereby stripped of rank, of title, and of all protections granted by this empire. You will be exiled beyond the outer ring, to a designated uninhabited world. Your survival is no longer the concern of this court." The words landed heavier than any physical weight, not because of their harshness, but because of how expected they were. Ethan nodded once, not in submission, but in acknowledgement, as if confirming something only he understood. A guard stepped forward, the faint glow of their armor casting sharp reflections across the floor, but Ethan moved before they could guide him, turning calmly toward the exit corridor where the light dimmed just slightly, enough to mark the boundary between judgment and aftermath, and still he didn't look back, not at the council, not at the towering chamber, not at the Empress whose decision had sealed his fate, because if he had allowed himself even a single glance, he might have seen it, the smallest fracture in perfection, the almost invisible shift in Lyra Vera's expression, not regret, not quite, but something dangerously close to it, something that didn't belong in a ruler who had just condemned a man to darkness. And as the chamber doors sealed behind Ethan with a soft, final hiss, the stars above continued to move, indifferent, precise, eternal, unaware that something far more unstable than any collapsing system had just begun to unfold. The transport shuttle did not wait for ceremony, it never did, its engines already humming with a low mechanical growl as Ethan stepped onto the narrow loading ramp, the air around it sharp with the scent of ionized fuel and cold metal, the kind of smell that clung to the back of your throat and reminded you that space did not forgive mistakes. He paused for half a second at the threshold, not out of hesitation but habit, his eyes scanning the horizon of the docking platform where distant ships hovered like silent predators against the endless black. No one came to see him off, no final words, no acknowledgement, just the faint hiss of pressure seals and the quiet understanding that once this door closed, he no longer belonged to anything that called itself civilization. Inside the shuttle the lighting was dim and functional, pale strips along the walls casting long shadows that shifted with every subtle vibration of the engine. Ethan took his seat without instruction, securing the restraint across his chest with a practiced motion, the material tightening automatically, adjusting to his frame as if it had done this 1,000 times before, which it probably had. Exiles were not rare, just rarely noticed. The cockpit remained sealed, no pilot visible, the ship operated on remote command, another layer of distance between him and those who had made the decision. the engine surged slightly. A rising pitch that settled into a steady hum as the shuttle lifted, smooth but firm, gravity pulling. Just enough to remind him that he was still tethered to something, for now, the city fell away beneath him, towers of glass and alloy shrinking into patterns of light, organized, controlled, perfect, everything the Empire claimed to be. Ethan watched it without emotion, not because he felt nothing, but because there was nothing left to resolve. What had needed to be done was already done, and what was coming could not be negotiated. A soft chime echoed through the cabin, followed by an automated voice, neutral, almost polite, destination confirmed. Estimated travel time, 9 hours, 23 minutes. Environmental conditions upon arrival, sub-zero climate, atmospheric instability, limited organic life detected. The words landed without weight, just data, just facts, but Ethan nodded slightly anyway, as if acknowledging an unseen speaker, his hand resting loosely against his knee, fingers still, steady. Outside the viewport the stars stretched into thin lines as the shuttle entered faster-than-light transition, the sudden shift bathing the cabin in a brief flash of pale blue light before settling into darkness again, and for a moment, everything felt suspended, time, motion, thought. Like the universe itself had taken a breath and decided to hold it. Far above, in a chamber now empty of witnesses, Lyra Vera remained seated long after the council had dispersed, the silence around her no longer ceremonial but heavy, personal. The projection of stars above had slowed, dimmed slightly as if responding to something unseen. She did not move immediately, did not call for attendants or advisors. Because this was not a moment that could be shared, her gaze remained fixed on the place where Ethan had stood, replaying the stillness of him, the absence of fear, the refusal to speak, and beneath it all, something that unsettled her more than defiance ever could, understanding. He had understood what the verdict meant, not just for him, but for her, and he had accepted it without forcing her to say what could not be said. Her fingers tightened once more against the armrest before finally releasing. A controlled motion, deliberate, as she rose to her feet, the fabric of her ceremonial attire shifting softly with the movement. No announcement followed, no command echoed through the halls. Instead she turned away from the throne and walked toward a secondary corridor rarely used, one that led not to public chambers or official transports, but to something quieter, something hidden beneath layers of protocol and expectation, the kind of path an empress was never meant to take. And yet her steps did not hesitate, because somewhere beyond the reach of her empire, a man had been sent into darkness carrying a truth that was never his to bear, and for the first time since ascending to power, Lyra Vera chose not to rule, but to follow. The shuttle touched down without ceremony, its landing struts pressing into a surface that did not welcome weight, the impact soft but final, followed by a long exhale of compressed air as the hatch disengaged with a mechanical hiss. Ethan remained seated for a moment longer, listening to the silence that followed. No distant traffic, no layered city noise, just wind moving across open ground. Low and constant like a warning that never needed to raise its voice. He released the restraint and stood, his boots meeting the metal floor. With a dull, grounded sound, every movement measured, efficient, as if routine could still exist in a place designed to erase it, the hatch opened outward and the first breath of the planet entered the cabin, cold enough to sting, thin enough to feel incomplete, carrying a faint mineral scent that settled deep in the lungs and stayed there. Ethan stepped forward into it without hesitation. The horizon stretching wide and pale under a dim sky where the sun hung distant and weak, casting a light that felt more like memory than warmth. The ground beneath him was uneven, layered with frost that cracked softly under each step, not quite snow, not quite stone, something in between that resisted definition the same way this place resisted comfort. Behind him the shuttle remained idle for exactly 6 seconds before the engines reignited, lifting with a steady hum that grew louder for a brief moment and then vanished into the upper atmosphere, leaving nothing behind but a fading vibration in the air and the quiet understanding that there would be no return. Ethan did not watch it go. He had already memorized that sound, already let it pass through him without holding on. Instead he turned toward the landscape ahead, scanning slowly, reading terrain the way he had been trained to. Small ridges to the east, a cluster of dark formations about half a mile out that might offer shelter, the wind shifting direction every few seconds, carrying fine particles that brushed against his coat and left faint patterns that disappeared as quickly as they formed. He adjusted the collar slightly, more out of habit than necessity, and began to walk, each step deliberate, conserving energy, setting a pace that could last hours, because here, survival was not about speed, it was about endurance, far above the cloud layer, hidden beyond the range of standard detection. Another vessel cut through the upper atmosphere without transmitting a signal, its exterior darkened to absorb light, its systems running on minimal output to avoid notice. Inside, Lyra Vera stood at the forward viewport, her posture straight, composed, but her eyes fixed on the faint coordinates projected before her, the same coordinates that marked Ethan's landing site. She had removed the markings of her station, no crown, no insignia, her attire simplified, functional, designed for movement rather than presence, because presence here would be a liability, not an advantage. The ship descended slowly, adjusting trajectory to land beyond visual range, a calculated distance that allowed observation without intrusion. When the vessel finally settled behind a natural ridge formation, the engines powered down to a low whisper, almost indistinguishable from the wind outside. Lyra remained still for a moment, her reflection faint against the glass, studying not her surroundings, but the decision that had brought her here. An empress did not leave her throne without consequence, did not step outside the structure of command and expectation, and yet the weight she felt now was not of responsibility, but of something far less defined, something that had taken root the moment Ethan chose silence over truth. She stepped away from the viewport and moved toward the exit hatch, her hand pausing briefly over the control panel, not in doubt, but in recognition, that once this door opened, she would no longer be acting as a ruler, but as something far more uncertain. The hatch released with a soft click, the cold air rushing in to meet her, sharper than before, carrying the same quiet warning, and for the first time in years, Lyra Vera stepped into a world where her authority meant nothing, and where the only thing that mattered was a man who had walked into the same darkness without looking back. The wind never stopped, it only changed its voice, sometimes a low whisper across the frozen ground, sometimes a sharper hiss that cut through fabric and found skin without effort. Ethan adjusted his pace as the terrain shifted beneath his boots, the frost giving way to harder rock that echoed slightly with each step, a subtle advantage. Sound carried differently here, easier to track, easier to read. He moved toward the dark formations he had marked earlier, now closer, rising from the flat expanse like broken teeth, their surfaces jagged but stable, offering the kind of cover that could break the wind and hold heat if used correctly. He reached the nearest outcrop after nearly 40 minutes of steady movement, his breath controlled, visible in short bursts that faded quickly into the cold air. He circled once, scanning, not for threats, but for patterns, signs of instability, loose edges, anything that might shift under pressure. Finding none, he stepped into the narrow space between two angled slabs, the temperature dropping slightly as the wind lost its direct path, the difference small but measurable, enough to matter over time. He knelt briefly, brushing away a thin layer of frost to expose the darker surface beneath, solid, dry, better for retaining warmth. He set down the small pack he had been issued, its contents minimal, standard exile protocol, a thermal sheet, a compact energy cell, a hydration unit calibrated for limited output, nothing excessive, nothing generous, just enough to extend survival if used with discipline. Ethan did not rush, he unfolded the sheet and secured it against the inner rock face, creating a barrier that would trap what little heat his body produced. His movements precise, efficient, the kind that came from repetition rather than urgency, as if he had done this before, or at least imagined it enough times to make it real. A faint sound reached him then, barely distinct from the wind, but not part of it. He paused, head tilting slightly, listening, not reacting, just confirming. The sound came again, softer, irregular, something moving against the rhythm of the environment. Ethan stood slowly, stepping out from the shelter with a controlled shift in weight, his eyes scanning the slope beyond the rocks, and there, partially obscured by drifting frost, was a small figure, low to the ground, its movement uneven, not fast enough to be a threat, not steady enough to be stable. It paused when he stepped closer, its form becoming clearer, a creature native to this world, small, with a thin layer of reflective skin that caught the dim light and scattered it in faint colors, its breathing shallow, visible in quick, uneven pulses. Ethan stopped a few feet away, not closing the distance completely, giving it space, giving himself time to read its behavior. The creature did not retreat, did not advance, it simply remained, as if waiting for something it did not understand. Ethan lowered himself slowly, one knee touching the ground, his movements deliberate, non-threatening, his hand reaching toward the hydration unit at his side. He hesitated for half a second, not because he doubted the choice, but because he understood the cost. Then he activated it, releasing a small measure of water into the open air, the liquid forming a thin stream that the creature reacted to almost immediately, its head lifting, drawn by instinct more than recognition. It moved closer, cautiously, then steadier, until it reached the edge of the stream, taking in what it could, its breathing easing slightly with each second. Ethan watched without expression, without commentary, simply observing the shift, the small change from struggle to stability, far beyond the ridge. Lyra stood in the shadow of her landing site, her form partially concealed by the terrain, her gaze fixed on the distant figures, the human and the creature, her senses enhanced just enough to capture the details, the movement, the exchange, and for a moment, the cold around her seemed to fade, replaced by something else, something quieter, something that did not belong to survival or strategy. She had asked once, in a different place, a different time, why a being would give resources to something with no measurable value, and now, watching from a distance, where her presence could not interfere, she saw the answer not in words, but in action, simple, immediate, without expectation, and it unsettled her more than any rebellion ever could, because this was not defiance, this was choice, and it was a choice her empire had never learned to make. The creature lingered only a moment longer after the water was gone, its small body steadier now, its breathing no longer sharp and uneven, and then it turned, disappearing slowly into the pale haze as if it had never been there at all, leaving behind only faint impressions in the frost that the wind began to erase almost immediately. Ethan remained where he was for a few seconds, watching the space it had occupied, not expecting anything in return, not waiting for acknowledgement, just confirming that it had moved on under its own strength. Then he exhaled once, slow and controlled, and stood, brushing the cold residue from his glove before stepping back toward the narrow shelter between the rocks. The light above had shifted slightly, the dim sun lowering just enough to stretch the shadows longer across the ground, temperature dropping with it in a gradual, predictable curve. He adjusted the thermal sheet again, tightening its edges, reducing exposure, small changes that would matter once the cold settled deeper into the terrain. He checked the energy cell next, its output steady but finite. Everything here came down to limits, how far something could be stretched before it stopped giving. He moved with that understanding built into every motion, every decision measured not in minutes, but in how long it could sustain him through the night. He sat finally, his back against the rock, knees slightly drawn in to conserve heat, his gaze drifting outward across the horizon where the wind carried faint streaks of frost like slow-moving smoke. There was no sign of life now, no movement beyond the natural rhythm of the planet, and yet the space did not feel entirely empty anymore. Something had shifted, subtle, but present, far beyond the ridge. Lyra had not moved from her position, her eyes still fixed on the place where the exchange had occurred, replaying it not as an event, but as a question, one that did not resolve itself through logic or calculation. Her breath formed faint patterns in the cold air, dissipating almost instantly, and for the first time since stepping onto the surface, she became aware of the temperature not as a data point, but as a sensation, something that pressed against her skin, something that required adjustment. She shifted her stance slightly, activating a minimal layer of thermal regulation beneath her clothing, the warmth subtle, controlled, nothing like the regulated comfort of the palace. This was different, this was earned moment by moment. She stepped forward then, slowly, carefully choosing her path along the ridge to maintain distance, to remain unseen, but closer than before, each step deliberate, her attention divided between the terrain beneath her and the figure ahead, the human who had been cast out without resistance, who now sat in the cold as if it were simply another condition to adapt to, not an enemy, not an injustice, just reality. She had expected anger, or at least resentment, something that would justify the decision that had been made, something that would confirm the narrative the Empire relied on. But there had been none, not in the chamber, not here, only a quiet consistency that refused to break under pressure, and that unsettled her more than any open defiance ever could, because it left no clear place to stand, no position of superiority to hold on to. She reached a point along the ridge where the angle allowed a clearer view without exposing her silhouette, and she stopped, lowering herself slightly to reduce her profile. The ground cold beneath her, uneven, real in a way the polished floors of her world never were, and as she watched Ethan settle into his shelter, conserving energy, preparing for the coming night without complaint or hesitation, a realization began to form, not sudden, not dramatic, but steady, like the slow drop in temperature around them, that this was not a man surviving exile, this was a man who had chosen it, and the difference between those two things was far greater than anything her empire had ever accounted for. Night did not fall all at once on this world, it crept in, slow and deliberate, draining what little warmth the sky had offered until the horizon blurred into a single muted tone. Ethan noticed the shift not by sight, but by the way the air changed, thinner, sharper, each breath carrying less comfort than the one before it. He adjusted his position against the rock, pulling the thermal sheet tighter around his frame, sealing in what heat he could generate, his movements small now, conserving energy, every action reduced to necessity. The wind altered its pattern as darkness settled, its direction less predictable, slipping through gaps that had seemed secure minutes before, testing every edge of his shelter, searching for weakness the way nature always did, without intention, without mercy. Ethan did not resist it, he adapted, shifting slightly, reinforcing the angles, his hands steady despite the cold that pressed against his skin like a constant question, how long, how far, how much. His gaze lifted once toward the dim outline of the sky, the stars beginning to emerge, not bright, not distant, but present enough to remind him that he was still under something vast, still part of a system that did not notice individual loss. He exhaled slowly, the breath visible for a fraction of a second before disappearing into the air, and then he closed his eyes, not to sleep fully, but to rest in intervals, short cycles that allowed awareness to remain just beneath the surface, ready to respond if needed. Far along the ridge, Lyra felt the change more sharply than she expected, the drop in temperature more aggressive now. The environment no longer passive, her initial calculations had accounted for the conditions, but they had not accounted for the experience of them, the way the cold moved, the way it found the smallest gaps and settled there, persistent, patient. She adjusted her own thermal regulation again, increasing it slightly, but even then, the sensation remained, a reminder that control here was limited, that comfort was not guaranteed by status or design. She remained low against the ridge, her posture steady, her focus still on the distant figure who had already adapted to the shift without hesitation. He had prepared before the darkness arrived, anticipated it, adjusted to it, not as an enemy, but as a continuation of the same condition he had accepted from the beginning. She watched the subtle changes in his position, the way he minimized movement, the way he aligned himself with the structure of the rocks to reduce exposure. These were not reactions born from panic. They were choices made from understanding, and that understanding carried a weight she could not easily define. Time passed differently now, measured not by clocks or schedules, but by the rhythm of breath and the slow progression of cold across the ground. Lyra remained where she was, though the strain in her muscles began to register, the uneven surface beneath her offering no true rest. She shifted once, carefully, maintaining her concealment, her attention never leaving the space where Ethan rested, and then, without planning it, without fully deciding, she spoke, her voice low, carried just enough by the wind to reach the shelter below. Why did you not speak? The words were simple, direct, not a command, not a judgment, but a question that had remained unanswered since the moment the verdict was given. The wind caught the sound, softened it, but did not erase it, and in the stillness that followed, the distance between them felt smaller than before, not measured in yards or terrain, but in the space between question and answer. Ethan's eyes opened slowly, not startled, not confused, but aware, as if some part of him had expected the moment to arrive. His gaze shifted slightly toward the direction of the voice, not searching for its source, not demanding visibility, just acknowledging its presence, and after a brief pause, measured not in hesitation but in choice, he answered, his voice steady, quiet, carried the same way through the cold air. Because you could not. The words settled into the space between them, simple, unadorned, but heavy with something that did not need explanation, and for the first time since leaving the chamber, the silence that followed was not empty, it was shared. The answer did not echo, it settled, quiet and deliberate, as if the world itself had paused long enough to let it exist without interruption. Lyra did not respond immediately, not because she lacked words, but because the ones she had no longer felt sufficient. Her breath slowed, visible in the cold air as she shifted slightly along the ridge, no longer hiding completely. The distance between them now less important than the truth that had already crossed it. Below, Ethan adjusted his position. Once more, the thermal sheet pulling tighter around his shoulders as the temperature continued its steady descent, but his attention had shifted, no longer fixed solely on survival, now shared with the presence he had acknowledged without needing to see. He spoke again, not louder. Not directed, but clear enough to carry. "You should not be here." The words were simple, not a warning, not an accusation, just a statement of fact. Lyra let out a slow breath before answering, her voice no longer concealed by distance. "And yet I am." There was no authority in it, no command, only certainty. She moved then, stepping down from the ridge, her form emerging from the pale darkness in measured steps, the dim starlight catching the soft blue tone of her skin, revealing just enough for recognition, not as a ruler, but as herself, unguarded, unhidden. Ethan watched her approach without surprise, without tension, as if this moment had already existed somewhere in his mind long before it became real. She stopped several feet away, close enough now that the cold between them felt shared, not separate. The wind moved between them, carrying fine particles of frost that brushed against their clothing and vanished into the air. Lyra held his gaze, her expression steady but no longer distant. "You knew," she said, the words quieter now, stripped of position. "You knew what the verdict meant." Ethan nodded once, the movement minimal but clear. Yes, there was no hesitation, no attempt to soften it, just truth. She studied him for a moment longer, as if searching for something she had not yet understood. "And you said nothing." Her voice carried a slight edge now, not anger, but something closer to disbelief. Ethan's response came just as steady. "There was nothing to say." The simplicity of it did not resolve the question, it deepened it. Lyra stepped closer without realizing it, the space between them narrowing to something more immediate. "You could have defended yourself," she said, the words pressing forward now. "You could have exposed the truth." Ethan met her gaze without shifting, his voice unchanged. "And what would that have done?" The question did not challenge her, it invited her to consider, to follow the path he had already walked. Lyra's breath caught slightly, not from the cold, but from the weight of what she already knew, the answer forming before she could speak it. The council would have turned, the empire would have demanded balance, and the truth would not have saved him, it would have replaced him. Her silence confirmed it, and in that silence, the distance between them changed again, no longer defined by status or decision, but by shared understanding. The wind shifted once more, colder now, pressing harder against the exposed surfaces. Ethan glanced briefly toward the horizon, measuring the change, then back to her. "You should go back," he said, not as dismissal, but as concern. Lyra did not move, did not retreat. Instead, she lowered herself slightly to the ground across from him, mirroring his position against the rock, the cold surface beneath her immediate, real. "No," she said quietly, her voice steady in a way it had not been before. "I signed your exile." The admission did not carry weight in volume, but in truth, it settled between them heavier than the cold. Ethan did not look away, did not react with shock or resentment. He simply nodded once more, as if confirming something already known. Lyra continued, her gaze unwavering now. "Then I will not leave you to it alone." The words were not dramatic, not declared, they were chosen, and in the stillness that followed, the night seemed to hold them there, two figures against a world that did not care, bound not by command, but by a decision that neither of them could take back. And for the first time since the exile began, Ethan was not alone in the dark. The cold deepened until it became a presence of its own, no longer just a condition but something that pressed inward from every direction, testing resolve in ways that could not be measured by instruments alone. Ethan shifted slightly, adjusting the thermal sheet to extend across the space between them without a word, the motion subtle, practical, offering without declaring it. Lyra noticed the gesture immediately, her eyes tracing the edge of the material as it settled closer to her side. The faint warmth it carried barely enough to register, and yet unmistakably different from the open air. She did not comment on it, did not thank him, but she adjusted her position to make use of it, her movements mirroring his earlier precision, smaller now, more deliberate. The wind shifted again, threading through the rocks with a sharper tone that carried fine crystals of frost into the narrow shelter. They struck against the stone with soft, irregular taps, a quiet rhythm that filled the space between spoken words. Lyra drew a breath, slower now, more controlled, her body adapting in increments, not fully accustomed, but learning. This world was not chosen at random, she said after a moment, her voice low but steady. Ethan glanced toward her briefly, then back toward the horizon. No, he replied, it never is. The simplicity of the exchange carried more than the words themselves, an understanding that systems like hers did not operate without intention, that every exile was placed, not simply removed. Lyra studied him again, the dim light catching the contours of his face, the calm that had not broken since the chamber. It is meant to erase, she continued, not as justification, but as acknowledgement. Ethan nodded once, then it is doing its job, he said. Not bitter, not resigned, just factual. The wind pressed harder against the rock, forcing a brief pause in the conversation as both adjusted instinctively, pulling closer to the structure that shielded them. Lyra's hand brushed against the surface beside her, the cold immediate, grounding. She looked down at it for a moment before speaking again. You do not resent it. The statement was more observation than question. Ethan's response came without delay. Resentment does not change outcomes, he said, then after a brief pause, added, it only wastes time. Lyra held that for a moment, turning it over not as a ruler would, but as someone encountering a concept that did not fit within established frameworks. And what does change outcomes? She asked, her voice quieter now, closer to curiosity than authority. Ethan's gaze shifted toward her again, meeting her eyes directly for the first time since she had come into view. Choice, he said, the word simple, but carrying a weight that settled between them with more force than the wind. Lyra felt the impact of it not as sound, but as recognition, the connection forming between what she had seen earlier, the water given freely, the silence in the chamber, the refusal to shift blame, all of it aligning under a single principle that her empire had never prioritized. She lowered her gaze briefly, not in submission, but in thought, and when she looked up again, something in her expression had changed, not softened, but clarified. Then I am making one now, she said, the words firm, grounded in something beyond protocol. Ethan did not respond immediately. Instead he adjusted the thermal sheet once more, securing it more firmly against the rock, reinforcing the small barrier that stood between them and the night. Then he leaned back slightly, settling into the position with a steadiness that suggested acceptance rather than surprise. The silence returned, but it was no longer empty. It carried the weight of decisions made and understood. Above them the stars continued their slow movement across the sky, indifferent to what had shifted below. And yet, in that narrow space between stone and wind, something had changed that no empire could measure, because for the first time, the exile was no longer defined by isolation, but by presence, and the darkness that had been meant to erase now held something it could not fully consume. Morning did not arrive with warmth, only with a thinning of darkness, a slow return of pale light that revealed the world exactly as it had been, unchanged, unmoved by the decisions made within it. Ethan opened his eyes before the horizon fully shifted, his breath steady, his awareness already present, as if he had never fully surrendered to rest. Beside him, Lyra remained still for a moment longer, her posture composed even in sleep's lightest form, the thermal sheet stretched between them, holding what little warmth the night had allowed them to keep. The wind had quieted slightly, not gone, but reduced to a softer current that moved across the terrain with less urgency. Ethan adjusted his position, careful not to disturb the balance they had established, then rose slowly, his joints responding to the cold with a stiffness that he worked through without complaint. He stepped out from the shelter, scanning the horizon once more. The same ridges, the same pale expanse, but now marked by the faint tracks of their presence, subtle lines in the frost that confirmed something had endured the night. Behind him, Lyra stirred, her eyes opening to the dim light, her first breath deeper than the last ones of the night, her body adjusting to the shift. She watched him for a moment before speaking. You expected to survive. The statement carried no doubt, only recognition. Ethan did not turn immediately, his gaze still outward. I expected to try, he replied, the distinction small but absolute. Lyra rose then, the motion slower than his, her body still adapting to the conditions it had not been designed to endure. She stepped out beside him, the cold meeting her again with familiar insistence, but it no longer felt foreign, only present. She followed his gaze across the horizon, seeing not just the terrain, but the path ahead, undefined, open. There will be no retrieval, she said, not as warning, but as truth. Ethan nodded once. I know, he said, then after a brief pause, added, you still have one. Lyra's eyes shifted slightly, not toward the sky, but toward the direction where her concealed vessel rested beyond the ridge, the option still there, still viable, a return to structure, to control, to everything she had left behind. She held that thought for a moment, not weighing it, not calculating its value, but recognizing it for what it was, a choice, and then she looked back at him. Her expression steady, resolved in a way that no council decree had ever required. Not anymore, she said quietly, the words final not because they ended something, but because they began it. Ethan studied her for a brief moment, not questioning, not challenging, simply acknowledging the shift that had taken place. Then he turned slightly, adjusting the strap of his pack, his posture aligning once more with movement rather than stillness. Then we move before the temperature drops again, he said. Practical, immediate. Lyra nodded, the motion small but certain, and stepped forward beside him, not behind, not ahead, but alongside, their pace matching without effort, two figures crossing a landscape that had been meant to isolate, now carrying something it had not accounted for, not resistance, not defiance, but presence. The wind rose again as they moved, brushing against them with the same indifferent force, but it no longer felt like a barrier, only a condition to pass through, and above them, the dim light of the distant sun reflected faintly in Lyra's eyes, not as a ruler looking over an empire, but as something simpler, something quieter, something human enough to be understood. And as their tracks stretched behind them across the frozen ground, they did not look back, because for the first time, the direction ahead was not defined by exile, but by choice.